On February 26, 2022, precisely 2 days following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and the European Union enacted a pivotal decision that irrevocably altered the global financial landscape. They declared Russia's exclusion from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, commonly known as SWIFT. This intricate messaging network links 11,000 banks across 200 countries and facilitates the processing of an astounding $5 trillion in daily transactions. Severing Russia's access meant Russian financial institutions could no longer engage in international payment transfers, effectively halting trade finance, cross-border transactions, and imposing severe economic isolation. The West hailed this as the ultimate financial sanction, predicting Russia's economic disintegration, a collapse of its currency, and internal upheaval for President Putin. Yet 2.5 years later, a surprising turn of events unfolded. Russia did not falter. Its currency stabilized and trade persisted, albeit through alternative channels. More significantly for the West, numerous nations, observing Russia's experience, began developing their own independent financial infrastructures. The underlying apprehension was clear. If the United States could unilaterally disconnect a nation from the global financial system for political reasons, it could do so to any country. This instance was not the first time a preeminent power had weaponized financial infrastructure. History shows this pattern occurring 4 times in the past 110 years. In each preceding case, a dominant power leveraged its control over the financial system to penalize adversaries. Consequently, the targeted nations sought and established alternative systems, while neutral countries hedged their exposure, ultimately diminishing the original weapon's efficacy. The dominant power, believing it wielded absolute leverage, inadvertently eroded the very foundation of its own ascendancy. This document will present 4 historical instances of this phenomenon. The recurring 5-stage pattern, demonstrably evident in the current situation involving SWIFT and the US dollar, points towards China as the principal beneficiary. Projections indicate that the United States has approximately 20 years before the dollar irrevocably loses its status as the world's primary reserve currency. For context, when Great Britain weaponized finance in 1914, it lost its reserve status by 1944, a 30-year period. The United States employed the SWIFT weapon in 2022, and the timeline suggests a swifter decline this time due to the pre-existence of alternatives and the accelerating pace of technological advancement. Before delving into how the SWIFT weapon backfired, it is crucial to grasp the nature and significance of SWIFT itself. SWIFT is not a bank. It neither holds nor transfers funds. Instead, it functions as a sophisticated messaging system. When Bank A in New York wishes to transfer $1 million to Bank B in Tokyo, SWIFT transmits a secure message between them, confirming the authorization for the transfer. The actual movement of funds occurs via correspondent banking relationships, with SWIFT serving as the indispensable communication conduit. SWIFT was established in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries, replacing the inefficient, insecure, and error-prone international payment system known as TX. SWIFT introduced standardized messaging, robust security protocols, and enhanced the speed and reliability of cross-border transactions. By 1977, SWIFT was handling 10 million messages annually. By 2024, this figure had surged to over 11 billion messages per year, averaging approximately 45 million daily. SWIFT thus evolved into the central nervous system of global finance. Its power stems from its Belgian base, ostensibly neutral, yet its board is heavily influenced by American and European banks. Furthermore, the United States possesses considerable legal leverage due to the settlement of most international transactions in dollars through New York banks, enabling the U.S. to compel SWIFT to exclude specific countries or financial entities. Exclusion from SWIFT renders international trade exceedingly difficult, leading to profound economic isolation. The United States has previously deployed this financial weapon, notably in 2012 when it pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks. This measure had devastating consequences for Iran, causing oil exports to plummet as buyers were unable to remit payments. Iran's economy contracted by 9%, and inflation soared to 45%. These sanctions compelled Iran to negotiate, culminating in the 2015 nuclear deal. The SWIFT weapon appeared to be successful. However, during that period, Iran diligently developed alternative payment mechanisms, including barter arrangements, cryptocurrency, and non-dollar trade agreements with China and Russia. Consequently, when sanctions were reimposed in 2018, Iran was better equipped to withstand the economic pressure due to its reduced reliance on SWIFT. The exclusion of Russia from SWIFT in 2022 represented a different scale of action. This involved not a minor nation, but the world's 11th largest economy, a significant energy exporter, a nuclear power, and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. The decision to cut Russia off transcended mere economic warfare. It served as a clear assertion that the U.S.-controlled financial system could unilaterally isolate any nation for political objectives. Every country observing this event understood the implicit message: defiance of the United States could result in the loss of access to the global financial system, the freezing of national reserves, the isolation of banks, and the strangulation of economies. This presented an existential dilemma for all non-Western nations. Would they accept perpetual vulnerability to American financial power, or would they proactively construct their own alternatives? The prevailing choice was to build alternatives, a decision that ultimately led to the backfiring of the SWIFT weapon. This historical pattern of financial weaponization consistently results in unintended consequences, having repeated 4 times over the past century. Each instance saw the dominant power miscalculate its leverage, inadvertently accelerating its own decline. The first example occurred with Great Britain during World War I from 1914 to 1918. Prior to World War I, the British pound held the status of the world's reserve currency, and the City of London was the undisputed epicenter of global finance, controlling approximately 65% of international reserves. Upon the war's commencement in August 1914, Britain enacted the Trading with the Enemy Act, empowering it to freeze the assets of German nationals and corporations. This led to the confiscation of German-owned businesses, bank accounts, ships, and property throughout the British Empire, a drastic departure from the traditional separation of warfare and financial contracts. The immediate impact on Germany was severe, with its companies losing assets globally, its banks barred from London markets, and its trade collapsing. Britain perceived this as a decisive strategic advantage. However, neutral nations observed this unprecedented action and drew a critical conclusion. If Britain could seize German assets, it could seize the assets of any nation deemed an adversary during any conflict it deemed significant. Consequently, money held in London was no longer secure unless sanctioned by the British government. Following World War I, neutral countries began to diversify their reserves away from London, increasing their gold holdings and establishing accounts in New York, Paris, and other financial centers. The United States experienced immense benefit, with New York banks acquiring business previously directed to London. By 1920, the U.S. held more gold reserves than Britain. By 1925, New York rivaled London as a financial hub. Formal recognition of this shift came at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, when the US dollar officially supplanted the British pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's weaponization of finance in 1914 initiated a 30-year trajectory from dominance to relative insignificance. The pattern is evident. Britain controlled the system, weaponized it, targets and neutral countries diversified, and Britain lost its preeminence. The second instance involved the United States and Iran in 1979. In November 1979, following the hostage crisis in Iran, President Carter froze all Iranian assets held in U.S. banks, amounting to approximately $12 billion, including $8 billion in bank deposits and $4 billion in other assets. At the time, this was the largest asset freeze in history. The stated justification was Iran's violation of international law by taking hostages, and the U.S. was acting to protect its citizens. The freeze was intended to pressure Iran to release the hostages. However, it precipitated unforeseen consequences. Nations worldwide, particularly in the Middle East and OPEC, abruptly realized that dollar reserves held in U.S. banks were susceptible to seizure not through military conquest or default, but through an executive order. A president could freeze national assets with a mere phone call, rendering sovereign wealth held in U.S. dollars effectively non-sovereign. Throughout the 1980s, OPEC countries began to diversify their reserves, reducing their dollar holdings from roughly 85% in 1977 to approximately 71% by 1991. They increased their holdings of Deutsche Marks, yen, and gold, and established accounts in London, Zurich, and Singapore to mitigate concentration risks in New York. Key allies, such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, reduced their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. This marked the beginning of a gradual decline in the dollar's share of global reserves, a trend that continues to this day. While the Iranian asset freeze achieved its tactical objective, leading to the hostages' release in January 1981, partly due to economic pressure, its strategic impact was profound. It demonstrated to the world that dollar reserves could be weaponized, prompting every nation to recognize the necessity of diversification. The U.S. gained leverage over Iran, but lost invaluable trust among other global actors. The third case concerns the United States and Russia in 2014. Following Russia's annexation of Crimea in March 2014, the U.S. imposed targeted sanctions, restricting access for Russian officials to the U.S. financial system and placing limitations on Russian banks. Crucially, Russia was not excluded from SWIFT. The sanctions were carefully calibrated to signal disapproval without compelling Russia to fully abandon existing financial systems. This proved to be a strategic miscalculation by the U.S., granting Russia 8 years to prepare. From 2014 to 2022, Russia systematically reduced its reliance on the dollar. Its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities plummeted from $130 billion in 2013 to just $2 billion by 2020. Russian gold reserves expanded significantly from approximately 1,000 tons in 2014 to 2,300 tons by 2022. Russia also developed SPFS, its own system for financial message transfers, effectively a domestic counterpart to SWIFT. Furthermore, Russia initiated trade agreements with China, India, and other nations, allowing for payments in rubles, yuan, or rupees, thereby circumventing the dollar. Russia established robust infrastructure for non-dollar trade. President Putin openly stated in speeches between 2014 and 2022 that Russia was reducing its dollar exposure due to the inherent insecurity of dollar reserves, explicitly identifying the dollar as a U.S. weapon and the necessity for Russian independence. Western analysts largely dismissed these pronouncements as mere rhetoric, arguing that Russia was too integrated into the global economy to decouple. However, Russia's intentions were serious. Consequently, when the 2022 sanctions were imposed, Russia was considerably better prepared. The 2014 sanctions had a partial effect, slowing Russian economic growth and deterring investment. However, they also provided Russia with the crucial time and impetus to develop alternatives. Had the U.S. either refrained from imposing sanctions in 2014 or opted for a complete SWIFT cutoff at that time, the subsequent outcome might have been markedly different. Instead, the U.S. adopted a middle ground approach that signaled intent while enabling significant preparation, a strategy that ultimately proved to be the least effective. The fourth and most significant example involves the United States and Russia in 2022. On February 26, 2022, the US and the EU announced the exclusion of major Russian banks from the SWIFT system. In addition, $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions were frozen. This was widely perceived as the nuclear option of financial sanctions aimed at isolating Russia economically as never before. The immediate repercussions were dramatic. The Russian ruble plunged 30% within 2 days. The Russian stock market was temporarily closed to prevent a systemic collapse, and panicked Russians depleted ATMs of cash. Western media declared economic victory, predicting Russia's collapse within months. However, an unexpected development occurred. Russia demonstrated resilience and stabilized its economy. The Russian central bank dramatically increased interest rates to 20%, halting the ruble's decline. Russia then demanded that European countries pay for gas supplies in rubles, artificially boosting demand for the currency. Within 3 months, the ruble had fully recovered its losses. Russian trade continued, rerouting through non-Western channels, with oil exports redirected to China, India, and the Middle East, and settlements conducted in yuan, rupees, and rubles. By late 2022, the Russian economy had stabilized, and by 2023, its gross domestic product experienced growth of 3.6%, outperforming both Germany and the United Kingdom. The most profound impact, however, was not on Russia, but on the US dollar and the SWIFT system. Every nation observing these events recognized that the United States was prepared to freeze reserves and sever SWIFT access for political considerations. This realization prompted countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil to contemplate their own vulnerability. Even if not currently in conflict with the US, potential future disputes over issues such as Taiwan, Kashmir, Yemen, or trade policy could lead to the freezing of their vast reserves or exclusion from SWIFT. The precedent had been irrevocably set. Consequently, these nations embarked on a path of diversification away from the dollar and SWIFT, actively developing alternative financial infrastructures. This is precisely the pattern observed when Britain's adversaries acted in 1914 and when Iran's allies responded in 1979. Thus began the 5-stage cycle of financial weaponization backfiring, a pattern that has repeated 4 times and is currently unfolding. The framework for this cycle is as follows. Stage 1 involves the dominant power controlling the payment system. From 1973 to 2022, the US effectively controlled SWIFT. While SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium, its reliance on dollar settlements through New York correspondent banks granted the US significant leverage. The Treasury Department could impose sanctions on banks, the Federal Reserve could restrict access to dollar clearing, and SWIFT's functionality was contingent on US cooperation. This control was underpinned by the dollar's status as the dominant global currency, itself a product of US economic and military might. Stage 2 entails the weaponization of this control for foreign policy objectives. From 2001 to 2022, the US increasingly utilized financial sanctions. Following the September 11th attacks, sanctions initially targeted terrorist financing and subsequently expanded to rogue states like Iran and North Korea, and then to Russia in 2014. Each escalation normalized the practice of financial warfare. By 2022, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the deployment of the SWIFT weapon appeared almost inevitable given the existing infrastructure, presidential authority, and political will. The US proceeded with the exclusion of Russia from SWIFT and the freezing of $300 billion in reserves. Stage 3 focuses on targets finding alternatives. Unable to utilize SWIFT, Russia turned to alternative systems. Its domestic SPFS system saw expansion, while China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, became a primary conduit for Russian trade. Cryptocurrency and barter arrangements were also employed. By 2024, an estimated 40% of Russian trade was conducted in non-dollar currencies. Bilateral trade between Russia and China reached $240 billion in 2023, predominantly settled in yuan and rubles. Similarly, Russia-India trade largely occurred in rupees, and Russia-UAE trade in dirhams. Russia's experience demonstrated that exclusion from SWIFT and the dollar system was survivable. Stage 4 involves neutral countries hedging their bets. This is a critical phase, extending beyond sanctioned nations to include numerous countries that, while currently unsanctioned, fear future punitive measures. China, observing the consequences for Russia, accelerated its de-dollarization efforts, reducing its holdings of US Treasury securities from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $775 billion by 2024. China also significantly increased its gold reserves, officially reported at 2,264 tons, but unofficially estimated to exceed 4,000 tons. China expanded CEPs, processing over $500 billion in payments by 2024, a substantial increase from $300 billion in 2021. Saudi Arabia, a long-standing U.S. ally, reassessed its position after witnessing the freezing of reserves. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced its willingness to accept yuan for oil sales to China, effectively breaking the 50-year petrodollar monopoly. In December 2024, Saudi Arabia joined BRICS, signaling a departure from exclusive alignment with the US. The UAE, another key Gulf ally, began settling trade with India in rupees and dirhams, bypassing the dollar. Brazil and Argentina initiated discussions for a common currency for bilateral trade. The BRICS nations, now expanded to 9 members including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, are actively developing a shared payment system and exploring a common currency potentially backed by gold and commodities. Even US allies are hedging their exposure. The European Union developed an alternative payment mechanism, initially for trade with Iran, known as Instex, with potential for broader application. Japan and South Korea are increasing their holdings of yuan reserves. Over 50 central banks are currently exploring or implementing alternatives to dollar-denominated SWIFT dependence. This trend is not driven by anti-American sentiment, but by the realization that $300 billion in reserves can be frozen through an executive order, making national reserves inherently insecure. Stage 5 marks the erosion of the original weapon's power. This is the current stage. While SWIFT remains dominant, its influence is diminishing. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024, a 13 percentage point reduction representing trillions of dollars in diversification. More critically, the dollar's share in international trade settlement has fallen from approximately 73% in 2022 to roughly 58% by 2024, a 15 percentage point drop in a mere 2 years. This represents the fastest de-dollarization in recorded history. Although SWIFT message volume continues to grow in absolute terms, its proportion of international messages is declining. CIPS processed 136 million messages in 2023, up from 91 million in 2022, a 50% increase in 1 year. SPFS handles approximately 2 million messages daily within Russia. India's Unified Payments Interface processed 12 billion transactions in 2024, including a growing volume of cross-border activity. These alternative systems are scaling rapidly. The crucial insight is that while the SWIFT weapon achieved tactical success in the short term, causing economic shock to Russia, its strategic outcome was failure. Russia survived, and crucially, the SWIFT weapon can no longer be deployed with the same effectiveness. Targets now anticipate and prepare for such actions, and neutral countries have developed alternatives, rendering them less vulnerable. This completes the 5-stage cycle: control of the system, weaponization, targets finding alternatives, neutral countries hedging, and the weapon losing power. Britain experienced this cycle between 1914 and 1944. The United States is currently undergoing a similar transition, projected to span from 2022 to 2042. Detailed data now demonstrates the current reality of this pattern. These are not predictions, but established facts. Russian trade data reveals a significant shift. In 2021, prior to sanctions, 87% of Russian trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, this figure has fallen to 60%, meaning 40% of trade is now conducted in yuan, rubles, rupees, dirhams, and other currencies. The bilateral trade between Russia and China has reached $240 billion, predominantly settled in yuan and rubles. Likewise, Russia-India bilateral trade stands at $65 billion, largely settled in rupees. Russia serves as a critical test case, proving that economic activity can flourish outside the dollar SWIFT system. China's CEP system processed approximately $12 trillion in payments for the entirety of 2020, a figure that surged to about $27 trillion in 2023, more than doubling in 3 years. CEPS now connects over 1,400 financial institutions in 110 countries and facilitates UN settlements, presenting a direct and rapidly growing alternative to dollar-denominated SWIFT. Central bank gold purchases provide further evidence. In 2022, central banks acquired 1,136 tons of gold, followed by 1,370 tons in 2023 and over 1,000 tons in 2024. This marks 3 consecutive years of purchases exceeding 1,000 tons, the highest sustained buying spree since the 1970s, just before the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. The primary buyers include China, Russia, Turkey, India, Poland, and Singapore, all converting dollar reserves into gold, an asset that cannot be frozen or sanctioned. Bilateral currency swap agreements are also on the rise. China has established currency swap agreements with over 40 countries, valued at approximately $500 billion, enabling trade settlements in local currencies without the dollar. Russia has swap agreements with China, India, and Iran. India has similar agreements with the UAE and Japan, among others. Brazil and Argentina are actively negotiating a common currency. ASEAN nations are discussing local currency settlements for intra-regional trade. All these initiatives bypass the dollar. The breakdown of the petrodollar system is also significant. For 50 years, oil was exclusively priced and traded in dollars, creating structural demand for the currency. However, in 2023 and 2024, this monopoly effectively ended. Saudi Arabia now accepts yuan for oil sales to China. Russia sells oil to India in rupees. The UAE accepts dirhams and yuan, and Iran sells to China in yuan. Iraq is also negotiating yuan acceptance. While the petrodollar is not entirely defunct, its exclusive dominance has been shattered. Once a monopoly is broken, its advantages tend to erode rapidly. The expansion of BRICS and its currency development further underscore this trend. BRICS expanded from 5 to 9 members in 2028. These 9 countries collectively represent 45% of the global population, 36% of global GDP, and 42% of global oil production. During the 2023 BRICS summit held in Johannesburg, member nations unveiled plans for the development of a common BRICS currency to be underpinned by a diversified portfolio of commodities, including precious metals like gold, as well as oil and rare earth elements. While this initiative has yet to be implemented, its underlying message is unmistakable. BRICS is actively constructing an alternative framework to the prevailing dollar-centric global financial system. The evidence supporting this trend is extensive and compelling. The erosion of dollar dominance, often referred to as de-dollarization, is not a hypothetical future scenario. It is a present reality that is rapidly accelerating. Each passing month witnesses a decrease in the dollar's proportion of global reserves. Every fiscal quarter sees an expansion in the volume of transactions processed through the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS. Annually, a greater volume of international trade is being settled using local currencies. The strategic deployment of SWIFT as a financial weapon effectively dismantled the dollar's erstwhile monopoly. To illustrate this unfolding transition, let us examine a historical parallel. How much time does the United States have before the dollar relinquishes its status as the primary reserve currency? We can infer potential timelines by analyzing the decline of the British Empire. In 1914, Great Britain leveraged its financial power by confiscating German assets. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the dollar formally supplanted the British pound as the world's leading reserve currency. This marked a 30-year transition from the initial act of financial weaponization to the ultimate replacement of currency dominance. However, it is crucial to note that Great Britain also endured 2 devastating world wars, which severely crippled its economy. The financial aggression alone did not lead to the pound's downfall. It was a confluence of financial weaponization, global conflicts, and subsequent economic mismanagement. The United States is not currently engaged in global warfare, and its economy remains the largest worldwide, suggesting that its currency's decline might proceed at a more measured pace. Nevertheless, the pervasive influence of modern technology is significantly accelerating all global processes. In 1914, the establishment of alternative payment systems required decades of development. In contrast, By 2024, CIAPS witnessed a remarkable expansion, growing from 12 trillion to 27 trillion in just 3 years. The exponential scalability of digital payment systems implies that the dollar's decline could be considerably more rapid. Based on historical precedents and the current pace of acceleration, my estimation places the dollar's loss of dominant reserve status within a time frame of 15 to 25 years from 2022. This projects a potential collapse in dollar reserve status somewhere between 2037 and 2047, not its complete eradication, but its forfeiture of preeminence. The dollar's share of global reserves is projected to decrease from its current 58% to approximately 35 to 40% by 2040. While still substantial, this would signify a departure from its hegemonic position. The euro might then account for around 25%, the yen for 20%, and gold alongside other assets for 15 to 20%, ushering in an era of multipolar currency dynamics where the trajectory is already firmly established. The dollar's share of reserves has already diminished by 13 percentage points between 1999 and 2024, a period of 25 years. If this rate were to persist, an additional 13 percentage point decline would bring its share to 45% by 2049. However, the rate of decline is demonstrably accelerating. The past 2 years alone have seen a 4 percentage point reduction. If this accelerated trend continues, the dollar's share could reach 45% as early as 2035. The projected timeline is therefore 1 to 2 decades, not centuries or generations. Let us now explore the practical implications of this shift. Presently, the United States possesses the capacity to sustain virtually unlimited budget deficits because the global economy requires dollars for trade and as reserves. Foreign nations acquire U.S. Treasury securities to secure these dollars, enabling the U.S. to borrow approximately $2 trillion annually at low interest rates. This global demand allows the U.S. to effectively export inflation. However, once the dollar's share of global reserves dips below 40%, this significant advantage will evaporate. Foreign demand for U.S. Treasury bonds will plummet, leading to a sharp increase in U.S. interest rates. Consequently, the ability to sustain budget deficits will become untenable. The United States will be compelled to balance its budget or face escalating inflation. The American standard of living, which is predicated on importing more than is exported and financing the difference through the issuance of dollars, will become unsustainable. This marks the end of an era of unearned prosperity. Now let us examine who stands to benefit and who will experience losses in this evolving landscape. China emerges as a principal beneficiary. It is the clear contender to assume the mantle of global financial leadership currently held by the U.S. China boasts the world's second largest economy, the most extensive manufacturing base, the highest trade volume, and is increasingly positioning its currency for global reserve status. CIP serves as China's equivalent to SWIFT. The renminbi is steadily gaining traction as a reserve currency, and China possesses substantial gold reserves. Furthermore, Chinese technology giants like Alibaba and Tencent are developing payment infrastructures that rival established Western systems. As the dollar's influence wanes, the renminbi's prominence will rise. China does not need to engage in military confrontation with the US. It simply needs to allow the dollar system to unravel under its inherent contradictions, a process exacerbated by American financial policies. Russia achieves strategic gains. While its economy is smaller than China's, Russia has demonstrated its resilience to swift exclusion. This precedent holds immense significance. Any nation previously apprehensive of U.S. financial leverage now recognizes the existence of viable alternatives. Russia's survival in the face of sanctions has shattered the illusion of U.S. financial omnipotence. Moreover, Russia has solidified its alliances with China, India, and Iran, among others, thereby ending its perceived isolation and positioning itself as a central player in an emerging alternative bloc. The BRICS nations, including Brazil, India, and South Africa, along with new members such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all stand to gain from a multipolar currency system. They will experience enhanced leverage, enabling them to skillfully navigate the complex geopolitical landscape by playing the US, China, and the European Union against each other. Crucially, they will be liberated from the constraints of dollar dependency. India provides a salient example of this newfound autonomy. Despite considerable pressure from the US, India maintained its economic ties with Russia, procuring Russian oil at discounted prices and conducting settlements in rupees. India faced no significant repercussions for these actions, illustrating the future trajectory for middle powers, greater self-determination, and diminished US dominance. Gold will also emerge as a winner. As nations lose confidence in fiat currencies, they invariably turn to gold. Central bank acquisitions of gold are currently at 50-year highs. Alternative payment systems will flourish, encompassing platforms like SIPS, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, SPFS in Russia, India's Unified Payments Interface, UPI, Brazil's PIX, and various cryptocurrency exchanges. Any system facilitating non-dollar, non-SWIFT transactions will capture increasing market share. Financial technology companies in China, India, Russia, and other nations will benefit from this diversification away from Western financial infrastructures. Conversely, who will be the losers? The United States will experience a decline in its global hegemony, not instantaneously or catastrophically, but incrementally and irrevocably. The dollar's status as the primary reserve currency forms the bedrock of American global influence. It underpins the nation's ability to sustain continuous deficit spending, empowers its capacity to implement effective sanctions, and allows the U.S. to maintain a lifestyle exceeding its economic output. As the dollar's dominance erodes, all these advantages will gradually dissipate. The U.S. will be compelled to balance its budget, rendering its extensive military apparatus unaffordable without recourse to limitless borrowing. Consequently, the American standard of living will decline relative to that of the rest of the world. This does not portend destitution for America. Rather, it signifies a transition to a more normalized economic standing, that of a large, prosperous nation, but no longer a singular global hyperpower. Europe will suffer alongside the United States. European nations have deeply intertwined their economies with the US dollar system and participated in sanctions against Russia, including the freezing of Russian assets and exclusion from SWIFT. While this alignment with US policy was a strategic choice, it has also tethered Europe to the dollar's declining fortunes. The euro possessed the potential to emerge as a credible alternative to the dollar, but Europe has not pursued this avenue with sufficient vigor. Instead, Europe has largely followed US leadership. As the dollar weakens, the euro will not automatically ascend to prominence. The renminbi is poised to fill that void. Europe risks becoming economically subordinate to both the United States and China. SWIFT itself will experience a diminished role. Though a Belgian entity, SWIFT is widely perceived as a Western-centric tool. As countries actively diversify their financial systems away from Western frameworks, their reliance on SWIFT will naturally decrease. While SWIFT will not vanish entirely, it will likely transform from the dominant global messaging system into one among several. SWIFT's revenue model is contingent upon transaction fees. As transaction volumes increasingly shift to CIPs, SPFS, and other emerging platforms, SWIFT's underlying business model will be weakened. Holders of dollars will see their wealth diminish. Individuals and entities possessing dollar-denominated assets, such as treasury bonds or dollar-denominated bank accounts, will face devaluation. This will not manifest as hyperinflation or an overnight collapse, but rather as persistent annual inflation rates of 5 to 10% as the dollar loses its purchasing power relative to other currencies and gold. A treasury bond yielding 4% interest when offset by 7% inflation and currency devaluation represents a negative real return. Investors will inevitably seek refuge in alternative assets, further accelerating the dollar's decline. American consumers will experience a reduction in their purchasing power. The United States habitually imports more goods than it exports, resulting in a trade deficit of approximately $800 billion annually. This imbalance has been sustainable solely due to foreign nations' willingness to accept dollars. When this acceptance wanes, the U.S. will be compelled to either increase its exports or reduce its imports, leading to fewer available goods, higher prices, and a diminished standard of living. The average American household, accustomed to the affordability of Chinese-made goods, inexpensive foreign oil, and a wide array of imported products, could face price increases of 20 to 30% over the next decade as the dollar's reserve status erodes. The timeline for this transition is now clearly delineated. The financial weaponization of SWIFT in 2022 initiated a predictable 5-stage backlash pattern. We are currently navigating Stage 4, characterized by neutral countries hedging their positions. Stage 5, the gradual obsolescence of the weapon, is commencing. By 2030, the dollar's share of global reserves is projected to fall to around 50%. By 2040, this figure could be approximately 40%. While the US will likely retain the largest single currency share, it will no longer possess dominance. This heralds a multipolar currency environment, with the United States occupying a weaker global position. Allow me to conclude with the final thought. The SWIFT weapon appeared formidable. In February of 2022, Russia faced frozen assets and maximum pressure. However, financial weapons, much like their nuclear counterparts, are often a one-time deployment. Once utilized, all parties involved are incentivized to develop countermeasures. Russia actively pursued alternative payment systems. China accelerated its CIPS development. BRICS expanded its membership and initiatives. The petrodollar system began to fracture. Consequently, the SWIFT weapon has lost its efficacy because any nation the US might consider targeting has either already established robust alternatives or is in the process of doing so. The United States could have sustained its dollar dominance through robust economic policies, free trade principles, and adherence to established international rules. Instead, it opted for financial coercion, freezing assets, severing SWIFT access, and employing the dollar as an instrument of leverage. While this approach proved effective tactically against smaller nations like Iran, it backfired spectacularly against Russia. This backfire is systemic, signaling that not just Russia, but a significant portion of the global community is actively disengaging from the dollar-based financial system. Great Britain weaponized finance in 1914 and relinquished its reserve currency status by 1944. The United States weaponized SWIFT in 2022. Applying this historical pattern suggests that the US could lose its dollar dominance by 2042, perhaps even sooner, given the accelerating impact of technology. This is not merely a prediction, it is an acknowledgement of a recurring pattern. Financial weapons invariably lead to retaliatory measures and the development of alternatives. The dominant power, in its perceived strength, mistakenly believes it is wielding ultimate leverage, when in reality it is inadvertently educating the world on how to build independent systems. Once these alternatives are established, the original system's power inevitably diminishes. The weaponization of SWIFT effectively ended SWIFT's monopoly, just as the weaponization of the dollar has undermined dollar hegemony. The primary beneficiary of this self-inflicted damage is China, the patient rival that has observed America strategically dismantle its own advantages. China did not need to defeat the US militarily. America's actions have effectively led to its own strategic disadvantage. The 5-stage pattern of weaponization and backfire is now complete. The United States controlled SWIFT and the dollar and then weaponized them against Russia. Russia responded by seeking and developing alternatives. Over 50 countries are now hedging their positions, and the weapon's potency is waning. This marks the conclusion of dollar hegemony, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet dissolution. It is not the result of military defeat, but rather a consequence of financial self-sabotage. The SWIFT weapon was effective only once. It will never regain its former influence because the world has learned a critical lesson: the imperative to build alternatives, diversify away from dollar dependence, and eliminate vulnerability to US financial power. If this analysis has illuminated a previously unseen pattern, if you grasp the concept that financial weapons invariably backfire, and if you recognize that the SWIFT cutoff signaled the beginning of the dollar's decline rather than the zenith of its power, then you possess a fundamental understanding of the geopolitical landscape for the next 2 decades. The dollar will recede, the renminbi will ascend, The world will embrace a multipolar currency system, and the United States will find itself in a diminished global position. This outcome is not attributable to Chinese aggression, but rather to American policy choices. The United States possessed a veritable golden goose in its currency's global dominance, and it effectively strangled it through the implementation of sanctions. Welcome to the post-dollar era, a reality that is not yet fully established but is rapidly approaching. The timeline is set, the pattern is evident, and the weaponization of SWIFT served as the undeniable trigger. In 20 years, historians will look back at February of 2022 and conclude that this was the moment American financial dominance began to wane, though the world at large did not fully comprehend its significance at the time.